Welcome to the... Hello, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Africa Oracle Security Summit. My name is Thaddeus Babaoye. I have the privilege of being your host for today's webinar. I am based out of Lagos, Nigeria. So with all the love from Nigeria, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Oracle to the Africa Security Summit. So it promises to be an exciting session, but I guess the question you would have in your mind is, what is the essence of a security summit for Africa? But before that, let me take you through a few of the ground rules. Since this is a webinar, it's going to be a live session, a live webinar. So you will have the opportunity to use some of the widgets that are showing at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to say that the unmute button, I believe, will stay that way for the rest of the webinar. You would have an opportunity to use the Q&A widget, however, to send your questions through to myself, the host, or any of the panelists, or even the moderator when we get to that version, that portion of this event. If you need to unmute, you can raise your hand. I will spot that and would have you muted when we get particularly to the question and answer session. So this is a recorded session, and the recording will be shared with all of us attendees at the end of the webinar. So we'd like to take all the questions and answers as much as we can, but for some of the questions that we can't take on this webinar, we will definitely make sure the answers get across to you. So here's a bit of an agenda that will guide us through today's session. After this brief intro, I'm going to bring on board Paul Toal, who is an Oracle specialist around security and OCI, a senior director. He will come talk to us for about 15 to 20 minutes on the steps that we can take to ensure we secure data and some of the intentions that Oracle has around security. So after Paul, we'll open it up for a panel session where we'll have two of our customers from Kenya and South Africa. I'll be introducing Andrew Guthua, who is the Chief Technology Officer for Virtual Pay Kenya, and also Simon Nair, who is the Senior Manager for IS Security in MTN South Africa. We'll come on board with Avinash. Avinash will be the moderator. He's Oracle's Technology Sales Consulting Leader for Africa, based out of Mauritius. Then we'll wrap up the session with the question and answer, and hopefully we'll take all your questions and we'll be able to provide the answers during that session. So I'm sure we can share a few thoughts around security just before I bring in Toal. One of the considerations you would have in your organization, it will be the ability to innovate, ability to launch products and services when required without compromising security. I believe that would be a fair statement to make. So what we're sharing today practically is the how. How do we ensure that we put all the bells and whistles in place, and also the governance around ensuring that when we say we have a secure environment, we are ready to innovate, and we're also watching everything that needs to be, ticking all the boxes that needs to be ticked around security. So without saying too much, I'll just turn it over to Paul Toal, my colleague, who will take us through this session and his presentation on security.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thaddeus. Let me share my screen. Okay. So thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. So as Thaddeus said, I'm Paul. I work within an EMEA role within Oracle in what we call the CISO advisory group. which is fundamentally talking to our customers about security in general, whether that's data security, whether it's identity and access management, whether it's cloud security. It's really understanding the challenges and concerns that our customers have and helping to really address those and talk about how we can address those and how we can help you to address those. So what we're going to do is go through and just look at some of the challenges that we're seeing organizations facing at the moment, and then some of the ways that we're approaching this and the philosophy that we have within Oracle Cloud Infrastructure in terms of how we can help you to be as secure as you can possibly be. Now, I'll pop the safe harbor statement up, but I fully expect not to talk about anything that's futures or roadmap. Everything I talk about, all the services that I talk about, are all generally available today. So you shouldn't have any concerns about what might be coming up in the future. So let's get straight into it. Let's understand a little bit of what I like to think of as state of the nation. Where are we today? What sort of issues do we see organizations facing at the moment? I think the first one, it would be remiss of me not to talk about ransomware. It is seen absolutely as the key threat at the moment. Whether you're listening to speakers from different countries' government departments, whether you're listening to large organizations, if you go to any conferences, everybody's talking about ransomware. It's the key threat that we are seeing. And I think what's so worrying about ransomware from my perspective is, if you look at these sorts of reports that I'm showing here, and these are 2 examples of many different reports I could have pulled, then what we're seeing with ransomware is it affects all types of organizations. Yes, there's a skew towards manufacturing, but the reality is most verticals will be affected by ransomware at some point. The other thing that I find very interesting is that it doesn't matter what size your organization is. There is good case studies. I use good in the loosest sense of the term. There are good case studies of organizations with 2 people that have been affected by ransomware, or large global organizations that have been affected. But I think what's most interesting to me, if you look at the graphic on the right-hand side, is everybody assumes that ransomware is always a result of email phishing, and that's how the ransomware gets in. And you can see that that is certainly one of the big factors and one of the big attack vectors that we see. But it's not the only one. We do see software vulnerability, whether that's unpatched software, whether that's 0 days. We do see those sorts of attacks. We see other types of attacks, as you can see there, like RDP compromise. So ransomware is a big issue that a lot of organizations are really struggling to get their head around at the moment and work out how they protect against that. The second challenge that we see is around where your data sits. When I was standing up and talking about security 10, 15 years ago, I'd be talking a lot about perimeter security and how you have all your data behind your perimeter in your data center. And as we all know, that's just not the case anymore. Your data is spread all over the place. And if you look at this report from Flexera, it shows that over 75% of organizations have data in multiple places. That might be multiple on-premise locations or multiple cloud locations, or probably both. So the perimeter's gone. We know that. It went a long time ago. So it leads to the question, can I still be secure? What approach do I need to think about to be securing my data, irrespective of where it sits in its deployment? The next challenge, which sort of sits alongside the last one in terms of data location, is a shared responsibility model when we talk about cloud. Everybody knows there is one. Everybody knows that it's a sliding scale of shared responsibility, depending on whether you're looking at software, platform, or infrastructure in the cloud. But there tends to be a lot of confusion over exactly who is responsible for what. And I think the challenge that that confusion has is, if you look at this prediction from Gartner at the bottom, they recognize that in general, cloud service providers are doing a good job. They state that by 2025, pretty much all cloud breaches, they go as high as say 99%, will have a root cause of preventable misconfiguration or mistakes by end users. And when they talk about end users, they mean the green box. They mean customers, not the cloud service provider. So they recognize that security is difficult. They recognize that it's hard to get security right. And therefore they recognize that most of the issues will be bad configuration or will be mistakes. that organizations are making. And we want to stop that. We don't want that to be the case. And then the final thing, if you look at the security tools, most organizations have got plenty of security tools. So people don't get breached because they don't have security tools. People have got antivirus and they've got firewalls and they've got email scanning and all the other types of SOC type tooling, etc. The challenge historically with security tools is, one, they tend to be very difficult to use. They tend to have a very steep learning curve. You tend to need to be an expert in the area. They can also be quite expensive, which means that a lot of organizations won't holistically roll out a security tool. They'll use it for a particular project or a subset of the organization because they don't have the budget, or that particular program or project doesn't have the budget to roll it out across the enterprise. You also find that a lot of these tools don't work together. They're very fragmented, they're very, very isolated. I read a report recently that said organizations on average have over 100 security tools. And if they're not talking to each other, if they're fragmented, if they're difficult to use, it leads to gaps, it leads to mistakes, it leads to misconfiguration. And that's what Gartner was talking about. So we need to really look at how we think differently about security. We can't have all this tooling that is fragmented. We can't have tooling that's expensive. We can't have tooling that is hard to use, because that will just facilitate more and more data breaches. So we've taken this problem away within Oracle, and we've been thinking about this for a long time. Now, if you know anything about Oracle, you'll know that Oracle has a very long and steeped history in data security. Now, don't worry, it's a very complicated diagram. I'm not going to talk through it. The point of really putting this slide up is to talk about all the different ways that we can provide security capabilities around the Oracle database. And this is just an example. And the reason I picked the database is because that's where your data typically will sit. And if you think about what the attacker's trying to get, they're trying to get your data. That's fundamentally what they're trying to get. So when we think about security of the Oracle database, we look at all the different attack vectors. We look at all the ways that an attacker might be able to get to your data, and we layer security controls around that. And this particular slide is what we call our maximum security architecture. It's been around in Oracle quite some time, and we keep adding to it, we keep improving it. But fundamentally, this is saying if you really want to defend against all the popular attacks against your data, whether that's coming from the application layer, whether it's coming from backups, whether it's coming from OS management, then you need to be looking at the maximum security architecture. And it's a mix of preventative controls, detective controls, administration or configuration controls, and also data-driven security. So just before I move on, I'm just going to pop a poll up. I'd be very interested to understand who's come across the maximum security architecture before. Because as I say, it's something we've had for a long time. We've got a number of different architectures for Oracle database. We've got the maximum security architecture, we've got the maximum availability architecture, but this is one that we talk about a lot from a security perspective. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to fill that in. As I say, don't worry about the detail on the slide. The point of this session isn't to go into all the different controls and details. So while you're responding to that, I'm gonna move on. I'll leave that up for a couple of minutes. So I talked about how Oracle takes a very data-centric approach to security. We realize where your sensitive data is. We realize the importance of protecting that data. So whether you're doing that in Oracle database running on premise, or whether you're doing that with Oracle database running in the cloud, or any other cloud resources, we still take that same approach within the cloud. We start with your data on the left-hand side. We can put controls around securing your data, and then we layer security on top of that. We lay security at the compute level, at the networking level. We put the right monitoring controls in place, and we take that security all the way up to the edge. And then underlying that is identity, because in this world of no perimeter, we need to think about how we apply security, and identity is the common factor across all of these where we can apply security. And that's very much the approach that we take within Oracle Cloud. So what this means is, if I think about Oracle Cloud and I think about the way that we approach security and the way that we think about security, it is very much a different take to what some of the other cloud providers are doing. And I really break it into 4 areas. So let's briefly talk through these 4 areas. The first one is about greater responsibility. We recognize security is hard. I've already talked about that. We recognize the shared responsibility puts a lot of responsibility on you as a customer. If you think about it, whether you're running software, platform, or infrastructure, you're always going to be responsible for your data. You're always going to be responsible for your users, and you're always going to be responsible for some level of configuration. And if you think about that responsibility, there's a lot that you need to do. You need to control patching, you need to control firewall rules, you need to control users, you need to control vulnerability scanning, for example. So there's a lot of things that you're responsible for as a customer within the cloud. So within Oracle Cloud, we look hard at how we can take on more of that responsibility for you. And that might be by doing more as Oracle, or it might be providing you very easy to use tools that allow you to meet your responsibility. And it's a mix of the 2 of those. So one very simple example is encryption. We realize the importance of encryption. So anything you put within OCI, whether it's in storage or whether it's in the database, will be encrypted at rest by default. You don't need to turn it on. You can't turn it off, but you don't need to configure it. We will do it for you unless you want to configure it. And that sort of leads on to the second one, really, which is about data safety and privacy. We want your data to be safe. So we put a lot of focus and a lot of controls around doing things like turning on encryption by default, giving you capabilities like database vault if you're using our database cloud services or any of the flavors of that, so that you can start to protect against privileged access to the database. So we really do focus on how do we put that security all the way down to the data. The third area, and for me, this is probably, I think, one of the most important ones, operational simplicity. I said security is hard. How do we make it easier? There's no point us giving you 50 tools within OCI, within Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, to meet your security if they're all really difficult to use. And we don't want to give you 50 tools anyway, because that's not going to help. We want to make your job as easy as possible to be as secure as possible. So we put a lot of focus on where we do provide capability, how do we make that as easy to use as possible? If we can automate things, we'll automate things. If we can turn things on by default, we'll turn them on by default. If we can rethink how we do something to make it easier, we will do that. And that's exactly what we've done within OCI. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. And then the final one is about control and custody. We recognize regulation is getting tighter across the world. A lot of organizations are starting to look at how they can put, for example, their data in their country, or how they can put it in their data center, but still take advantage of cloud. So we put a lot of time and effort within Oracle Cloud Infrastructure in how do we make that happen. We have nearly 40 regions across the globe where you can pick and choose exactly which region you want to put your data in. Your data will stay in that region. It will not be moved out of that region. You can even go as far as putting the data in your own data center. We have options around OCI that allow you to deploy the data within your premises using dedicated region cloud at customer or using our Exadata cloud at customer solutions. They're still run and operated as cloud services, but the data sits within your data center. So we have flexibility to allow you to have that control over where you want that data. And we have the relevant accreditations. So what does that really mean? Well, from a security perspective, I'll break it down into 3 areas. Simple, prescriptive, integrated. What do we mean by that? Well, I've said this before, we try and make security as simple as possible. Prescriptive, we recognize that it's a large global organization with 200,000 employees. So we provide you the rules, the recipes, the policies, so you can be more secure by default. So your security posture is kept very high. We give you the flexibility to tweak that if you want to tweak that, but we don't force you to tweak that. And then finally, we want everything that we do to be an integrated set of tools. So whether we are using software, platform, or infrastructure as a service, the security tools that you're using work together across all 3 of those layers. So what benefits does that really give you? Firstly, it tries to shift that burden more towards the left. So put more responsibility on Oracle as the cloud service provider and reduce your responsibility, or not necessarily reduce responsibility, but make it easier for you to meet your responsibility. If we can take on ownership of a particular area, we will. If we can't, we'll make it as easy for you as we can to meet that particular responsibility. The second one is cost. A lot of organizations see security as a huge cost. We want to eliminate that. You'll see in a minute that we provide the majority of our security services within OCI at no additional cost. Why? Because we want you to be using them. We want you to be as secure as possible, and you shouldn't have to pay a penalty for wanting to be secure. And then finally, there's a lot of talk at the moment in the industry about zero trust. So we put a lot of focus on how can the capabilities and controls within OCI help you work towards zero trust. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So let's relook at the maximum security architecture from a cloud perspective. So if you deploy Oracle database on premise or you deploy it in the cloud, it's the same Oracle database. So you have exactly the same tools and controls available to you. It's no different. But we also recognize that, as I said before, not everybody's a security expert. And some of those tools around database security take some knowledge and effort to implement. So we wanted to reduce that barrier. So one of the things we did within cloud was we introduced DataSafe. What DataSafe does is it gives you the ability to run security assessments on your database, to run user assessments, to look at the risky users. It allows you to identify sensitive data and mask that data. And it allows you to centralize audit from your database. And it does it in a very simple to use, easy to use console. In addition to that, around cloud database, we turn on network encryption by default. We turn on at-rest encryption by default. If you want to manage the keys, you can do, but you don't have to. We'll manage them if you don't want to. It's that prescriptive complemented by flexibility that we provide. We also give you database vault, so you can manage your privileged users and the access to the data within your database. So you can see that diagram is massively simplified. Now we've moved it to cloud because we can take advantage of the speed of cloud to introduce new capabilities like DataSafe. There's a number of case studies in this presentation when we share it that I will encourage you to watch the videos for. Soho is a great example of how they use DataSafe and the value that they get from DataSafe. So as I sort of move towards wrapping up here, how can we help you to move forward on your journey towards deploying secure workloads? Well, firstly, I briefly touched on this. The majority of our security services that we provide within Oracle Cloud are done so at no additional cost, all the ones in green. Where we can't quite provide them at no additional cost, quite often there is a free version or there's a certain amount of that service that's available for free, and then it's usually a fairly nominal cost on top of that. In fact, this slide isn't even particularly up to date. There was a security launch at the back end of last month where we introduced even more new capabilities like threat intelligence, a threat detector, that are all provided at no additional cost within OCI. I talked briefly about zero trust. I'm lucky enough to be the co-author of a white paper which talks about zero trust security and how you can approach it within Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. I encourage you to follow the links, have a look at the paper. You might find it useful. And then finally, I would encourage you to sign up for a trial. If you sign up for a free trial within OCI, you get a number of credits that you can use against the services, but you also get access to a very generous allowance of always free services, including compute. So even if you want it for a personal project, if you run a local soccer club and you need a website, then I would encourage you to take advantage of those always free services, and you'll get to see some of those security capabilities in action within OCI. We have a secure landing zone, which is a Terraform set of scripts that will build you a good baseline secure deployment within OCI against the CIS benchmarks. The Zero Trust white paper that I wrote, I recorded a session recently that talked about the Zero Trust paper. You can look at that on YouTube. I encourage you to watch that if you're somebody who's more visual rather than reading. So to summarize, there's a lot that we do within OCI to make you as secure as possible. And there's a lot of ways that we really think hard about security and how we can think hard about security so that you don't have to, so that it's easier for you. And ultimately, why we're here. We're here to reduce risk. We're here to reduce cost. We're here to help you improve your security posture. And all of that leads to better compliance, ultimately, at the end of the day. And that's really what we're looking to do. So I'm not going to go through them now, but when we share the deck later, there are a number of customer case studies I would encourage you to have a look at. If you've got any follow-up questions after this event, my email address is in the deck. By all means, reach out to me. And with that, I'm going to thank you for listening. And I'm going to hand back to Thaddeus.
Thank you, Paul. Quite appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. So, but just before we move on to the next session, I'd like to indulge everyone who is participating in the summit to let's just learn a new language. I mean, Africa has 50 countries. So it'll be interesting to know that this session is interactive if we can tell us what security means in your local language. So whilst we're preparing for the next session, I'll indulge all participants to think about what the word security means in your local African language. And maybe we take it a step further. We'll just have the flag of the country where we are listening or participating from, just so we can learn a new language. But while that is going on, I'll tell you a true story, short one. So a friend of mine who was concerned about what was going on in his home decided that there were a lot of things were missing in his bedroom and he needed to do something about it. So he did the natural thing, which is, I'm going to secure my gate. And so he thought, oh, maybe the gate is not enough. I need the front entrance secured. And he did that. And maybe that was not enough. He thought perhaps the windows, maybe that is not enough. He thought about the ceiling and did something about it. So he ended up in a cage, as it were. But the real problem was the housemaid, who is usually in the house and has access to everything else within the house. And that brings me to Paul's comment and Oracle's approach to security, the zero trust. And that is right from the design phase. When you think about security for your infrastructure, for your environment, you have to absolutely think from the design phase on what could possibly go wrong. So whilst we're still waiting for more participants, just to confirm that we're all here and still listening, okay, do me a favor, just so I know that you can hear me well and you can see me good. Let me know what security is in your local African language, and kindly do put the color or the country where you're coming from or you're participating from. So we're moving on now to the, thank you very much whilst you do that. Now we're moving to the panel discussion. And I would like to yield the stage at this point to Dr. Avinash Ramtahul of Oracle, who will then moderate this session and introduce the panel discussants. And I'll be back, possibly to take question and answer. Avinash, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Thaddeus, and thank you, Paul, for the very interesting session that you just delivered. And we, as a panel, we will take it forward from that point. I would also like to thank all the attendees who've invested their time to be attending today this webinar summit. But before I go to the panel and request my panelists to introduce themselves, I'd just like to very quickly catch up on a few points that Paul mentioned, and we will link it to the next session we're going to start. So we take it from Paul's session that one of the key ways of preventing security breaches is through proper configurations, which actually is a matter of complete onboarding of the cloud service provider and also change management, which would include security training as well. And security is really not about the number of tools. We can have X number of tools, but what do we do with those tools is also another lesson that we take from Paul's session. And the maximum security architecture that we see on premise is actually also available on the cloud and in a hybrid environment. And zero trust security is not a product, but it is more of an approach to addressing the challenge of information security. And the burden of security gets gradually shifted from the customer onto the cloud service provider, of course, with a certain level of responsibility that still resides. For example, the configuration that one resides. And with cloud security or with data moving to the cloud, whether it is fully cloud environment or a hybrid environment, there certainly is a reduction in pressure on capital expenditure moving on to operational expenditure. And data safe is a very interesting term that was brought forward as well. Known to many of you already, I just thought I'd mention database, data safe again, which essentially is around collecting and configuring audit information so that any traceability requirements can be met in case of a detective process for an information security breach. We need to know who has had access to which part. And also it finishes with the masking of data to ensure that companies remain within the bounds of compliance, whether it is statutory requirements or regulatory requirements. So these are some of the key points that we take forward from your session, Paul, and thank you so much for bringing these on the table today. And I now have the pleasure of introducing you Simon Nare from MTN. Simon is joining us today to help us with this session. So Simon is the senior manager for information security at MTN in South Africa. And we also have the pleasure of welcoming Andrew Guthua, who is the Chief Technology Officer for Virtual Pay in Kenya. I myself had the opportunity to interact with these two lovely gentlemen, and I can actually assure you that the next 30 minutes that we're going to spend on this panel will be very enriching for all of us. So at this point, I would like to first just put a question, and when you are intervening, Andrew and Simon, please start with an introduction of yourself with some more details that you would like to share with the audience today. First of all, I would like to put it to you, Andrew and Simon, that information security strategy is now key to business success. What would be, from your point of view, the most important pillars of such a strategy in a multi-cloud hybrid environment? May I then start with Andrew, please? We would really like to hear your perspective on this point.
Yeah, thank you, Avinash. So if I may start with introducing Virtual Pay. Virtual Pay is a payment service provider based in Nairobi, Kenya, with operations globally. We have a presence in over 14 countries within and around Africa, licensed by multiple jurisdictions. So as a payment service provider, data security is a key concern to us. We have to ensure that the customer's data that we have is secured both during transmission and on storage. So with the services that we've gotten from Oracle right now as a customer, we're able to ensure that things like data at rest encryption are achieved. Virtual Pay is certified by several international bodies, including the ISO 27001 and PCI DSS. So for us to keep in compliance and ensure the security of the customers' information that we gather and process, we are required by the standards, ensure that all data is stored and transmitted securely.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So we see how important this strategy, information strategy is for you, especially given the nature of your business, dealing with financial information, dealing with sensitive information, right? So thank you on that. And Simon, can we please have you share your perspective around this point? Maybe start with an introduction of yourself.
No, thank you, Avinash. My name is Simon Nari. I work for MTN South Africa. I'm the senior manager here. So my role is to make sure that I implement end-to-end security, both for the on-premise as well as the cloud environment that MTN is moving into. So, you know, when I listen to your question, I'm already trying to think about some of the things I went through when we had to prepare the organization to move into the cloud. And so I think your question is around what is really one of the most important pillars. I'll tell you there are a number of pillars, but maybe let me just focus on either 3 or 4 that I think came out strongly in my journey to help M10 to move to the cloud, right? and so for me, the most important one that I can think of and I can share with the audience is that when you think about moving from on-premise to the cloud, or when you think about implementing a hybrid model where you've got data sitting on-premise and data sitting on cloud, one of the key and most neglected item or process is what I call your lack of standardization. It is important that when you want to move to the cloud, to ensure that we implement standardized processes. And I'll give an example, simple. What I mean here is, if for an example, on-premise, Paul earlier spoke about your CIS standards. If on-premise, you implement your CIS standards on your on-premise infrastructure, I would say, please do the same on your cloud infrastructure. Do not do something different on your on-premise and do something different on your cloud infrastructure. That's a key pillar for me in a multi-cloud and hybrid environment. Right? So that's number 1. And number 2, I think, and as I said, most of these are not really new, but number 2, Paul has already mentioned this. Ultimately, we all want to protect data, right? So do not forget all the controls you need to protect your data, whether you're talking about encryption, and we can talk about encryption at rest, in transit, all of those things. You need to make sure that your data is encrypted. And luckily, most, including Oracle, by the way, most of the cloud providers do enforce encryption of data at rest and even in transit. So please do not forget that. Make sure that when you get your service provider, that you are very sensitive and take care to make sure that they protect your data. The third one, Avinash, that I can go through quickly, which I think was also mentioned, is it is important, and this is one of the key pillars of zero trust, as was mentioned. It is important to have a very strong identity and access management. This is very key, because remember, with cloud means you access data anywhere. Without a strong identity and access management, your hybrid environment will be a disaster. I'll tell you what, let me give you an example. And I mean, research is there that shows that areas where they've been breached, one breach would have started in cloud because the administrator is using a different form of access in the cloud than what they use on-premise. So it's important that you've got a unified form of directories and make sure you use the latest protocol, you federate your data so that whatever access you have, it's seamless, it's managed central. That's very important. And the last one, I mean, has already been mentioned, which is key. And I know that most of the time when we meet our service providers, we don't take care of this. Look at that shared responsibility model. Make sure that you know what you are responsible for and what your service provider, your cloud provider is responsible for. Those are, I think, the 4 I can mention.
Thank you so much, Simon, for sharing this insight. You know, in fact, yes, the identity management system is actually critical. So you are able to actually, through the life cycle of users, really manage and control their different actions across different areas of the system. And talking about the areas of the system, different areas carry different data. And not every piece of data in the organization has the same level of sensitivity or impact should the integrity and confidentiality be compromised. Therefore, the process of data classification also will define the amount we're going to invest. We do not want the story to be part of the story that Thaddeus just narrated to us, having people from inside itself doing bad things to the system while we have the overall perimeter secured. Therefore, data classification internally also needs to be managed properly and ensure that the right people have access to it. Now, in light of this, Andrew, we know we talk a lot about data classification, but in practice, we may not really be actually classifying it the way we document the classification process. Therefore, in between theory and practice, there is a difference. And this window of difference can be the risk. It can be exploited. What would be your take on that, Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Avinash. So it's true. You can have the policies on paper in place stating that these are the standards or these are the procedures within which our organization is governed. But if you do not live by the word, and this actually stems and needs to start from the top management, because in my view, top management support is what really indicates whether a particular policy or a way of doing things is going to be followed. So in my thinking, once an organization has put in controls and procedures in how data is classified and governed and access to it is governed, it needs to be lived by, the word needs to be lived, not just having it as a documentation or just a piece of paper that we wave around. So in my view, the top management support is what really assists an organization to achieve their objectives in as far as data classification goes. Again, with the top management buy-in, they will have a trickle-down effect. So to the rest of the organization, that strategy will be followed.
Yeah, thank you for that, Simon. So as we say, data classification, for everybody on this call today, they would know that around them there is data, and they would know that the company wants to secure data and provide access on a role-based access control model, right? And that would take the data classification process to be very systematic and to be thoroughly followed. So Simon, we know that MTN in South Africa, well, MTN is not just in South Africa, you are operating across the African region, the Middle Eastern region, maybe even going up to Europe in some cases. And then you are also, I think you are also exposed to and bound by the GDPR as well, which mandates data classification. So can you share your experience around that, Simon?
Thank you, Avinash. So I mean, let me firstly just describe in simple terms what data classification means. So think about data classification as a way to give your data some form of an identity. Now, an identity simply means this is how we'll be able to know who you are, right? So data classification at the core, it's a way to make sure that as your data traverses the different environments on premise and on cloud, every system that interacts with that data is able to quickly see that, okay, this data is classified at this level. Therefore, these are the controls I need to put to make sure that the data is protected. And that's as simple as that. I mean, you've got a lot of tools in your environment that interact with the data, whether it's your DLP tool, whether it's your record management tools. All of these tools, they need to be told by the data itself how the tools will interact with this data. So one of the things that I found to be a challenge and maybe ignored in the process of data classification is organizations sometimes classify, but they forget to tell the other system in the other tools in the ecosystem how they should interact with the data that's been classified. So one of the things we've pushed in my environment was to make sure that beyond classification, which is, by the way, as Andrew just mentioned, it's you get a management support, everybody supported, please classify this data, it's important. But beyond that, we went hard and in breadth to make sure that the tools that are going to interact with data, whether it's the firewall, whether it's the email platform, whether it's the DLP, all of these tools, they are ready to process this data. And what I mean by that, these tools will know if a data comes in and is classified as, I don't know, whichever system you use, highly confidential. The tool has been told that a highly confidential data cannot go out via an email. Whoever must approve. That's really what we've seen. And if you approach it in that way, you're going to have the most successful data classification, unlike what mostly happens in environment where it gets classified and no controls put in place, and classification just become a word, not something that can be implemented.
Right, absolutely. Simon, thank you. And we can see also from both Andrew and yourself, the passion oozing from the words that you're putting forward, and your body language as well. So we've got another 3 minutes before we close this session. I would like to put on the table a last question here, and I would request you please to interact with that question. Actually, you know, whether it is regulatory challenges around data sovereignty or even statutory constraints, moving to the cloud can be a challenge. And we know you did it successfully. So from a security perspective, for you to achieve that point, what were the challenges that you faced? Any regulatory or statutory challenge you faced? And if you did, how did you actually manage to overcome them? And I think this is a very important point for our audience here, because on our continent here, we do tend to actually hold on to the data because we want to ensure that we protect ourselves and our people, our borders, and our sovereignty of the country. So it's a key point. What would be your reaction to that? Let's start with Andrew, please.
Yeah, yes, Avinash. So as I mentioned, Virtual Pay has a range of jurisdictions in which we operate. So the question that you are asking, during our move to the cloud, we did encounter these challenges due to the different regulators in the different jurisdictions and their policies as far as data sovereignty goes. So we have some regulators who are more accepting to having data residing on the cloud, and others who are very strict, requiring us to have the data sitting within their borders. So of course, we had to go and figure out a way how to go about it. In some instances, we had to set up local data centers within those particular countries and have everything replicated there. But the good thing is that with the technology that we have available to us, we're able to ensure that we can link up all the different disjoint jurisdictions and have a unified service on the cloud. But again, with the regulators, you really have to do as they are advising. So maybe there's something that we've been thinking, even the other fintechs in Africa, we really need to lobby the regulators to be more accepting to, the modern technologies, especially having cloud native applications and having data that are sitting on the cloud, not necessarily in country. Yes.
Absolutely. So you've actually experienced this challenge, and you managed to find your way to address that. I think some of the regulators do actually offer a process that you would need to follow, where you satisfy a set of criteria, and that process would actually give to you the permission to export your data outside of the borders. So countries do actually have that types of derogations as well. And Simon, how was it at your end?
Yeah, thanks. Avinash, I'll just give you a simple thing. I agree with everyone. That's a challenge for most of us in Africa, particularly because most of the your cloud hyperscalers do not have data centers across our environment. But if anyone is experiencing that, one of the things I would suggest you do, please think about a hybrid model. Think about this hybrid model. A hybrid model where you've got certain infrastructure, certain data being processed on premise, or certain application running on the cloud. That could be one way to try and talk to your regulator and say, look, we want to get the benefit of the cloud, but this type of data, which is classified in this context, whether it's a personal data, we're going to process it on premise, but certain data that is not classified, we can process it on cloud. So in short, I would say anyone thinking about the regulatory and all the stuff around going on the cloud, explore hybrid cloud model. You might find your solution there. And that's one of the things we have done in our environment.
Absolutely, excellent. So there are two limbs to that. One is probably on the legal side to follow the process to obtain the approval or the permission of the regulator. And the other one is the technical limb as well, where we can have the data still reside in country, but the application resides on the cloud and data transits, goes and comes back. We are still compliant. Excellent, Simon. So thank you so much for sharing this insight and these ideas. And thank you, Andrew, as well, for all the contribution I think you've shared light that must have actually given ideas to the audience here. And thank you, Thaddeus, for hosting us. Thank you, Faith, for planning this. Thank you to the audience as well for attending with us. And Thaddeus, over to you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Avinash. So one thing that we don't lack at all in Africa is the diversity in language. And whilst your session was going on, I learned a few new words in the local language, security. So I'm going to just enrich my African vocabulary. Security is shireletsego in some language, solokeho in Sesotho, ishireletso. Please pardon what I'm saying, if it makes any sense. But just to get a sense of, the active participation that is ongoing whilst we transit into the question and answer session. It's Ulinzi in Swahili, Tibeka in Ethiopia, Ebiokwelinda in Uganda, Sepedi in South Africa, Usalama in Swahili, Umutekano, not sure what country that is, but just to give you a sense that there's been an active participation throughout this webinar. So I want to now transit into the question and answer session. Possibly if there are any questions that you may have from Paul's presentation or from the panel session, kindly use the same question and answer widget, post them, or you can indicate by raising your hand at the bottom, and we'll unmute you to take a few questions within the 4 to 5 minutes that we have left. Can everyone still hear me good? Okay, that was a bait. I wanted someone to from the participants to say something. But if there are, I'm still reading, please see, keep the questions coming if there are. Okay. I don't see any hand up. Okay, I've seen one hand up right here. Just a moment to identify who. Okay, it's Victor. Is this Victor or Victoria? Right, I can unmute you now, and yes, the floor is yours. We'll take your question.
Yeah.
But kindly introduce yourself, maybe
Yeah.
the organization you work for.
Thank you.
Victor.
Okay.
Please
My
go
name
ahead.
is Victor. My name is Victor. I'm attending this meeting from Rwanda. So I'm a freelancer. Okay, thank you. So I have a question from Paul's presentation. He pointed out that people that don't get breached because they don't have security tools, but because of misconfiguration. So I do like to understand how OCI or Oracle database provide a solution for this. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Was that specifically Oracle database or Oracle Cloud in general?
Oracle Cloud in general.
Okay, sure. So the short answer is we do it by a combination of turning more security on by default. So I talked about the example with the database where we turn on encryption by default. Now, if you buy Oracle database and deploy it on premise, if you want to encrypt data at rest using the database capability, you buy a database security option called transparent data encryption, which is part of advanced security option. In the cloud, that's provided. Not only is it provided, it's turned on by default. So your data will be encrypted at rest by default. It will be encrypted on the network by default. We will give you the option to manage keys within a HSM if you want to do that yourself. We will do that for you if not. We will give you the option to use DataSafe for no additional cost. So that's an example with database, but the same is true broader within the cloud. So again, any storage that you use within OCI, whether it's block storage, boot volumes, object storage, file storage, all that will be encrypted by default. You cannot turn it off. I know one of our panelists said that all the cloud providers will encrypt by default. Well, they will, but in some of the other clouds, you can turn it off if you don't want to encrypt, in the same way that you can turn logging off if you don't want logging. You can't in OCI. We audit all API calls. You can't turn it off. We turn on encryption by default. You cannot turn it off. The only option you have is, do you want to manage the keys or do you want Oracle to manage the keys? It's entirely up to you. You have that choice. And then for things like security posture, we realize that we build OCI. So as Oracle, we know what sort of things you might do that would weaken your security posture. So if you create an object storage bucket and you make it public, that's a weak security posture. If you spin up a compute instance and you put it in a public subnet and you give it a public IP address, that's a weak security posture. So we give you a set of rules in what we call a recipe as part of our CloudGuard capability, which again is no additional cost. And that will look at your tenancy, it will watch your tenancy, and it will look for security problems with your posture. And it will warn you about them. It'll say, I found this problem. You've created this bucket and it was public. But it goes further than that. It will give you the option to automatically remediate it. So if it sees a public bucket, it can automatically make it private again without you having to do anything. You don't have to write any scripts. You don't have to code anything. It will just do it automatically. So it's those sorts of things where we're really rethinking security and saying, okay, we don't want to put the onus on you. We want to make security as easy. So where we can turn it on, we will. Where we will automate it, we will. Where we can be more prescriptive and give you the guidelines, give you the guardrails so you can be more secure, we absolutely will. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Yes. So thanks, Victor, and thanks, Paul, for that. I believe that's about the much we have the time for. But if you do have other questions, if you put them on the chat, we'll capture them and we'll send you the response directly. So on behalf of Oracle and all the panelists, I'd like to say a special thank you first to all our customers, all the participants on this call. Special thank you to Andrew and Simon for being part of the panelists. Thank you to Faith, Mel, Grace for putting this together. Just generally say thank you. This webinar, some of the contents will be shared with you, but just one thing, there will be a 1-question survey just to help us get better. So we want to hear from you. We want your feedback about the event. And for all other follow-up and inquiries, you may direct them to my colleague, Faith.Oka. Our details are there on the screen. Without much ado, thank you very much. I'd like to give you the rest of your morning back. Thanks for being a wonderful participant in today's Africa Security Summit. Thank you and have a good day. Bye, everyone.